The Sterling mansion sat atop the highest hill in Crestview Heights like a crown made of glass and white marble. To anyone passing by, it was the ultimate symbol of the American dream. Behind those towering gates lived Arthur Sterling, a billionaire venture capitalist, his wife, Evelyn, a former prima ballerina known for her elegance, and their 12-year-old son, Leo, a piano prodigy with eyes as blue as the Aegean Sea. Every Sunday morning, the Sterlings could be seen in their garden, enjoying an outdoor breakfast. The sunlight filtered through the weeping willow trees, illuminating a scene of domestic bliss. Arthur would laugh at Leo's jokes, and Evelyn would delicately sip her tea, looking at her family with a pride that seemed unbreakable. But the most important person in the house was the one who was never in the photos. Clara had been the Sterlings' head housekeeper for 13 years. She was a quiet woman, moving through the hallways like a shadow. She knew exactly how Arthur liked his coffee, 3 drops of cold milk, no sugar, and which silk dresses Evelyn preferred for gala nights. Most importantly, she was the one who had raised Leo. While Evelyn was busy with charities and Arthur was closing deals in Tokyo, it was Clara who bandaged Leo's scraped knees and stayed by his bed during fevers. To the world, Clara was the perfect servant, invisible, efficient, and loyal. But to Clara, the Sterlings were a puzzle she had finished solving a long time ago. One Tuesday evening, the family was preparing for Leo's birthday gala. It was to be the social event of the season. Arthur was in his study, finalizing a multi-million-dollar merger. "Clara!" Arthur shouted from the top of the stairs. "Where is my silver tie? The one with the emerald clip?" Clara appeared instantly at the base of the staircase, her hands folded neatly over her apron. "It is in the 3rd drawer of your dressing room, Mr. Sterling. I polished the clip this morning." "Thank you, Clara." "I don't know what we'd do without you," Arthur said, barely looking at her as he hurried back into his room. Clara watched him go, her expression unreadable. "You don't know what you've already done." She thought that I and the kitchen. Clara began preparing Leo's favorite snack, sliced apples with a hint of cinnamon. As she worked, Evelyn walked in, looking stressed. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at her skin. "Clara, make sure the caterers use the vintage crystal for the champagne tonight." "And Leo, where is he?" "He's in the music room, ma'am. Practicing his concerto," Clara replied softly. Evelyn sighed, leaning against the marble counter. "He's so talented. Sometimes I look at him and I can't believe he's mine. He has my passion, but Arthur's determination." Clara stopped slicing the apple. She kept her back to Evelyn. "He is a unique boy, Mrs. Sterling. Truly one of a kind. He is the Sterling legacy," Evelyn said firmly, as if trying to convince herself. "Everything we do is for him." Evelyn left the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Once she was gone, Clara picked up a small, old photograph from her pocket. It was hidden behind her ID card. It showed a younger Clara holding a baby, but the setting wasn't a mansion, it was a small, dimly lit hospital room in a different city. Clara looked at the photo, then at the expensive apples on the counter. The "Happy Family" image was a beautiful painting, but Clara knew that if you scratched the surface, the canvas was rotten. Tonight, at the gala, the scratching would begin. The night of the gala arrived with a cold, elegant breeze. The driveway of the Sterling estate was lined with black limousines. Inside, the grand ballroom was a sea of velvet, diamonds, and the scent of expensive lilies. Arthur stood near the fireplace, holding a glass of vintage scotch, his booming laugh echoing against the high ceilings. Evelyn moved through the crowd like a queen, her smile fixed and radiant, though her eyes remained restless. Leo, the star of the evening, sat at the grand piano in the center of the room. He played a complex Chopin nocturne with a technical precision that left the guests in awe. "He's a miracle," whispered a wealthy donor to Arthur. "Where does that talent come from? Neither you nor Evelyn have a musical bone in your bodies." Arthur laughed, though his grip on his glass tightened slightly. "Nature works in mysterious ways, Julian. He's a Sterling. We excel at everything we touch." From the shadows of the arched doorway, Clara watched. She was dressed in her formal black and white uniform, carrying a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres. She watched Leo's fingers fly across the keys. She knew a secret that no one in this room suspected: Leo wasn't playing from his heart, he was playing from fear. He played because he knew that if he stopped being perfect, his mother's love might vanish. As the music ended and the room erupted in applause, Clara made her move. It wasn't a loud move, she was a woman of whispers and shadows. She walked toward the master library, a room strictly off-limits to guests. She knew Evelyn would be going there soon to retrieve a gift she had hidden for Leo, a rare, gold-inlaid watch that had belonged to Arthur's grandfather. Clara entered the library first. She reached into her apron and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. It wasn't addressed to anyone. She placed it inside the velvet box, right underneath the golden watch. Just as she finished, she heard the clicking of heels. Clara slipped behind a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf. Evelyn entered the room, closing the door behind her to catch a moment of silence. She looked exhausted. The perfect mother mask dropped for a second, revealing a woman who looked terrified of her own life. She opened the safe, pulled out the watch box, and opened it to check the gift. Her breath hitched. She saw the corner of the yellowed envelope. Evelyn frowned, pulling the paper out. As she read the few lines written inside, the color drained from her face. Her knees buckled, and she had to grab the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from falling. The note simply said, "The blood of a stranger cannot keep a legacy alive forever. Does Arthur know about the night in St. Jude's Hospital?" Evelyn's hand shook so violently that the note fluttered to the floor. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's impossible. No one knows. Is everything all right, Mrs. Sterling?" Evelyn jumped, nearly screaming. Clara was standing by the door, her face a mask of polite concern. "Clara. I didn't see you there," Evelyn stammered, quickly kicking the note under the desk with her silk heel. "I'm fine. Just a dizzy spell. The heat in the ballroom is quite intense." "Of course, ma'am," Clara said, her voice smooth as silk. "Would you like me to bring you a glass of water? Or perhaps your medication from the bedside table?" Evelyn looked at Clara, searching her eyes for any sign of malice. But Clara's eyes were blank, professional, and cold. "No, just go back to the guests." "I'll be out in a moment," Evelyn commanded, trying to regain her composure. Clara bowed slightly and left. But she didn't go back to the ballroom. Instead, she went to Leo's bedroom. The boy had retreated there to escape the noise. He was sitting on his bed, looking at a birthmark on his wrist, a small, jagged shape that looked like a lightning bolt. "You played beautifully, Leo," Clara said from the doorway. Leo looked up, a small, genuine smile forming on his face. "Thanks, Clara. But Dad says I missed a beat in the middle. He says a Sterling doesn't make mistakes." Clara walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, something she would never do if the parents were watching. "Leo, do you know why that birthmark is special?" Leo shook his head. "Mom says it's just a mark." "Actually," Clara whispered, "it's a map. It shows you where you came from. And very soon, you're going to find out that you are much more special than just a Sterling. Leo looked confused, but before he could ask a question, the door burst open. It was Arthur. He looked furious. "Clara. Why aren't you serving the guests?" he barked. Then he turned to his son. "And you, Leo? Your mother is in the library crying and won't tell me why. What did you say to her?" The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The happy family was starting to bleed. The gala continued downstairs, but inside the master library, the air was freezing. Arthur Sterling was not a man who tolerated secrets. He had built an empire on information, and he could smell a lie from a mile away. After Clara and Leo left the room, Arthur didn't follow them immediately. He noticed the way Evelyn had been glancing at the floor near the desk. He waited until she went to the washroom to compose herself, and then he returned to the library. He knelt, his expensive suit trousers crinkling, and reached under the mahogany desk. His fingers found the crumpled yellowed paper. As he read the words, "Does Arthur know about the night in St. Jude's Hospital?" His jaw tightened so hard a vein began to throb in his temple. He knew that name. St. Jude's was the private clinic where Leo had been born during a summer storm 13 years ago. But why would the blood of a stranger be mentioned? He didn't scream. He didn't break anything. Arthur was a predator. He moved in silence. He tucked the note into his pocket and walked out to the balcony, staring down at the hundreds of wealthy guests. He looked at Leo, who was standing by a fountain, looking lonely despite the crowd. Arthur looked at his son's profile, the shape of his nose, the curve of his chin. For the first time in 13 years, he looked for himself in the boy's face. And for the first time, he realized he couldn't find a single trace. Late that night, after the last limousine had departed, the mansion fell into an eerie silence. Evelyn was in bed, pretending to sleep, her heart hammering against her ribs. Arthur sat in the dark in the living room, a single lamp casting long shadows. Clara entered the room to clear the remaining glasses. "Clara," Arthur said, his voice a low growl. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," she replied, stopping in her tracks. "You've been with us since the beginning. Since we brought Leo home from St. Jude's." Clara stood perfectly still. "I have, sir. I arrived 2 days after his birth." Arthur turned his head slowly. "Was there anything unusual about that time?" "Evelyn was very sick after the delivery. I was in London for a week finishing the Petrotech deal. The doctors said the birth was complicated." Clara took a step forward, the light hitting half of her face. Mrs. Sterling was indeed very fragile. There were many nurses. Many babies. It was a chaotic night at the clinic due to the power outage from the storm. "But I am just a maid, sir. I only see what I am meant to see. Don't play games with me, Clara." Arthur stood up, walking toward her. "I pay you for your loyalty." "Loyalty is a two-way street, Mr. Sterling," Clara said boldly, her voice devoid of its usual subservience. "You pay for my labor. My silence, however, that has a different price." Arthur stepped back, shocked by her tone. Before he could retort, a loud crash came from upstairs. They both rushed to the second floor. Leo was standing in the hallway, a heavy porcelain vase shattered at his feet. He was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of anger and confusion. In his hand, he held a medical file, one that had been hidden in the back of Evelyn's closet. "Leo, go back to bed," Arthur commanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Is it true?" Leo's voice trembled. "I found this in Mom's dressing room. It's my birth record. But the blood type listed here, it's O negative." Arthur stopped. He was type AB. Evelyn was type AB. It was a biological impossibility for them to have an O-negative child. Evelyn appeared in the doorway of her bedroom, clutching her silk robe, her face white as a sheet. She looked at the file, then at Arthur, then at Clara. Clara stood at the end of the hallway, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. The happy family image hadn't just cracked, it had shattered like the vase on the floor. "Arthur, I can explain," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "Explain what, Evelyn?" Arthur's voice was terrifyingly calm. "That our son isn't ours? Or that you've been paying someone to keep this quiet for over a decade?" "He is mine." Evelyn shrieked, losing her grip on her composure. "I carried him. I gave birth to him. But who is the father, Evelyn?" Arthur stepped closer, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "And why does Clara look like she knows the answer better than you do?" Clara stepped into the light, looking at Leo with a gaze that was almost motherly, but a version of motherly that was laced with a dark, vengeful satisfaction. "The truth is much older than the boy, Mr. Sterling," Clara said. "And it doesn't just involve a hospital. It involves a debt that was never paid." The silence that followed Arthur's question was heavy, suffocating the air in the grand hallway. Leo stood frozen, the medical file still clutched in his trembling hand. He looked between his father's cold fury and his mother's collapsing spirit. "Clara," Arthur whispered, his voice dangerously low. "What debt?" Clara took a slow, deliberate step forward. The humble maid was gone. In her place stood a woman who had waited 13 years for this exact moment of gravity. "Do you remember the summer of the great storm, Arthur? 13 years ago, St. Jude's Clinic was overflowing," Clara began, her voice steady and rhythmic. "Evelyn was there, desperate. She had suffered 3 miscarriages in 2 years. You told her that if she didn't produce an heir, the Sterling family trust would pass to your brother. You put a price on a heartbeat." Evelyn let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hands. "I did what I had to do for this family," Evelyn cried. "I was protecting our future." "No," Clara countered sharply. "You were protecting your status." That night, when the power went out and the backup generators failed, the nursery was in chaos. There was another woman in the ward next to you. A woman with no money, no husband, and no legacy. Just a woman who had a healthy baby boy. Arthur's face turned a ghostly shade of gray. "What are you saying, Clara?" "I'm saying that Evelyn's baby didn't survive the night," Clara said, her eyes flashing with a cruel light. "And the other woman? She died from complications. Or so the records say. But the truth is, money was exchanged. A doctor was paid to look the other way. A grieving mother was erased from history, and her child was placed in a silk cradle." Leo's breath hitched. I was that baby. I'm not a Sterling." Clara turned to Leo, her expression softening for the first time. "You have the blood of a survivor, Leo. Not a billionaire. The woman who died that night, her name was Maria. She was my sister." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The invisible maid wasn't just an employee, she was the biological aunt of the boy she had been serving for over a decade. "You knew," Arthur hissed, turning to Evelyn. "You stole a child to keep your jewelry and your mansions." "I loved him." Evelyn screamed, moving toward Leo, but the boy stepped back, his eyes filled with horror. "I raised you as my own, Leo. I gave you everything. You gave me a lie." Leo shouted, his voice cracking. "Everything I thought was mine, my name, my history, it's all stolen." Arthur looked at Clara, his mind already spinning with the legal implications. "Why now, Clara? Why wait 13 years to destroy us?" "Because," Clara said, pulling a small digital recorder from her apron, "I needed to wait until Leo was old enough to understand. And I needed to wait until I had enough evidence to ensure you could never use your money to bury the truth again. I have the bank transfer records from Evelyn to the clinic director. I have the original birth certificates." Arthur stepped toward her, his hands balled into fists. "I can have you erased, Clara. I can make sure you never see the light of day." "Try it," Clara challenged, her chin held high. "The files are already set to be sent to every major news outlet in the city if I don't check in with my lawyer by midnight. It's 11:45 p.m., Arthur. The clock is ticking on your perfect life." Evelyn sank to the floor, her silk robe sprawling around her like a broken wing. The power had shifted. The maid was now the master of the house, and the billionaire was a man with a crumbling kingdom. As the midnight deadline approached, the dynamics of the Sterling mansion devolved into a desperate negotiation. Arthur, ever the businessman, tried to find a price for Clara's silence. 10 million, Arthur said, pacing the library. 20. Name your price, Clara. We can set up a trust for Leo. He can still be a Sterling. We can fix the paperwork. Clara laughed, a dry, bitter sound. You still think everything is for sale? I didn't stay in this house for 13 years to get rich, Arthur. I stayed to watch you rot from the inside. I watched you put pressure on a boy who wasn't yours. I watched you treat your wife like a trophy and your staff like furniture. She turned to Leo, who was sitting on the stairs, staring at nothing. "Leo, pack a bag. We're leaving." "He's not going anywhere," Arthur barked. "He's my nephew," Clara said firmly. "And legally, he is the son of Maria Santos. If this goes to court, you'll be charged with kidnapping and fraud." "Is that the legacy you want, Arthur?" Evelyn looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Leo, please. I am your mother in every way that matters." Leo looked at her, his gaze cold and unfamiliar. "You didn't even tell me my real name. You let me grow up thinking I was a miracle, when I was actually a victim." Leo stood up and walked toward Clara. The bond they had shared, the scraped knees, the late-night fever dreams, now made sense. She was the only real thing in his life. "I'm going with her," Leo said, his voice stronger than it had ever been. As they walked toward the grand front doors, Clara stopped and looked back at the sprawling marble entrance. "By the way, Arthur, the Petrotech deal you're so proud of? I leaked the documents to your competitors yesterday. By morning, you won't just be childless, you'll be bankrupt." The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, leaving Arthur and Evelyn Sterling alone in their massive, silent tomb of a home. The morning sun did not bring warmth to the Sterling mansion, it brought the vultures. By 8 a.m., the news of the Petrotech leak had hit the stock market. Arthur Sterling stood in his glass-walled office, watching the red numbers on his monitor cascade downward like blood. His net worth was evaporating in real time, but the financial ruin was nothing compared to the silence in the house. Evelyn had locked herself in the master suite, the sound of breaking glass occasionally echoing through the door. Arthur picked up his phone and dialed his head of security. "Find them. I don't care what it costs. Find Clara and the boy." "Sir," the voice on the other end hesitated. "Clara didn't just leave. She left a trail. A trail that leads straight to the district attorney's office. There are police cars headed your way." Arthur dropped the phone. He looked at the family portrait hanging on the wall, the three of them smiling in front of a blue backdrop. He realized now that Leo's smile in that photo was the only genuine thing in the room, and even that was based on a lie. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment on the other side of the city, the air smelled of dust and old books, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of lilies in the mansion. Leo sat at a small wooden table, staring at a birth certificate that bore the name Mateo Santos. "Mateo," Clara said softly, placing a glass of milk in front of him. "It will take time to get used to." Leo looked at her. The woman he knew as a quiet servant was now his only link to reality. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Clara? Why let me grow up in that house for 13 years? Clara sat across from him. Her hands, calloused from years of scrubbing floors that weren't hers, shook slightly. "Because I was a nobody, Mateo. If I had tried to take you when you were 5, Arthur would have used his money to put me in prison or worse. I had to wait until they trusted me completely. I had to wait until I had enough dirt on them to bury them both. So I was just a weapon." "Leo," Mateo asked, his voice trembling. "A way for you to get revenge?" Clara reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away. "No. You were my sister's heart. I stayed to protect you. Every time Evelyn pushed you too hard, every time Arthur ignored you, I was there. I was the one who actually loved you." "But you lied too," Mateo whispered. "Everyone in my life has been lying to me since the day I was born." Back at the Heights, Evelyn Sterling had finally opened her door. She didn't look like the elegant ballerina anymore. Her hair was matted, and she was wearing a stained silk robe. She wandered into Leo's empty bedroom. She touched his piano, running her fingers over the keys. A discordant note rang out. "He's coming back," she muttered to herself. "He just went for a walk. He loves his mother." Arthur entered the room, his face aged by 10 years in a single night. "He's gone, Evelyn. The police are downstairs. They're asking about the hospital records from 13 years ago. They're asking about Maria Santos." Evelyn turned to him, a haunting smile on her face. "Arthur, tell them to go away. Tell them we're busy preparing for the winter gala. Leo needs to practice his Mozart. Evelyn, listen to me." Arthur grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "The money is gone. The boy is gone. We are going to jail unless we figure out a story." Evelyn pushed him away with surprising strength. "Your story, Arthur. Not mine. You were the one who demanded an heir. You were the one who said a sterling without a son is a failure. I only gave you what you asked for." The front door downstairs was kicked open. The sound of heavy boots on marble signaled the end of the Sterling era. As the officers moved through the house, seizing files and computers, Evelyn sat at the piano and began to play a frantic, messy version of the song Leo had played at the gala. She played until her fingers bled, humming a lullaby to a son who was never hers. As the legal battle began to roar in the outside world, Clara took Matteo to a place she had kept secret even from her own thoughts. It was a small storage unit on the outskirts of the city. "What are we doing here?" Matteo asked. He was wearing a plain hoodie now, looking like any other kid, but the weight in his eyes was far too heavy for a 13-year-old. "There's one more thing you need to know," Clara said, her voice tight. "About your mother. About Maria." She unlocked the unit. Inside were boxes of old letters, baby clothes, and a set of medical journals. Clara pulled out a dusty leather-bound diary. "My sister didn't just die of complications, Matteo. She was healthy. She was a fighter." Clara opened the diary to the last page. "She wrote this the night you were born. She was scared. She said a woman in the next bed, a woman with blonde hair and a cold voice, had offered her money for her baby. Maria said no. She told the woman to leave her alone." Matteo read the jagged handwriting. "The rich lady won't stop looking at him. She says he's a perfect child. I'm scared to sleep." "The power outage wasn't an accident," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I spent years investigating. Arthur's company owned the firm that maintained the hospital's generators. They failed on purpose, Matteo. The chaos was planned." Matteo's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a story of a desperate woman stealing a baby. This was a calculated, corporate kidnapping. The happy family wasn't built on a lie, it was built on a crime. "They killed her, didn't they?" Matteo asked, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "They let her bleed out in the dark while they took you to a private suite," Clara said, tears finally falling. "And that is why I won't just see them in bankrupt. I want to see them in cages." Suddenly, a shadow fell over the entrance of the storage unit. "That's a very touching story." "Clara," a familiar, cold voice said. Clara and Matteo spun around. Standing there, looking disheveled but holding a small black pistol, was Arthur Sterling. The air inside the storage unit grew thick with the smell of gasoline and old paper. Arthur Sterling, the man who once controlled markets and moved mountains with a signature, looked pathetic. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie was gone, and his eyes were bloodshot. But the gun in his hand was very real. "Arthur, put that down," Clara said, stepping in front of Matteo. Her voice didn't tremble. She had faced this man's arrogance for 13 years, she wasn't afraid of his desperation. "You think you've won, don't you?" Arthur sneered, the pistol shaking slightly in his grip. "You think you can just walk away with my son and my legacy? I made that boy. I paid for every meal, every lesson, every breath he took. You didn't make him," Clara spat. "You stole him. You murdered his mother by turning off the lights in a room where she was fighting for her life." Arthur laughed, a high-pitched, jagged sound. "The generators were old, Clara. Accidents happen in business. But Evelyn, she was weak. She couldn't handle the accident. She started writing checks, leaving a paper trail like a breadcrumb path for a rat like you to follow." Matteo peered from behind Clara's shoulder. "Did you know?" he asked, his voice small but piercing. Did you know I wasn't yours the whole time? Arthur's gaze softened for a fleeting second as he looked at the boy. In the beginning, I didn't care. I needed an heir. But then I saw you play. I saw you win. You were a sterling because I decided you were. That's how power works, Matteo. Reality is whatever I say it is. Not anymore, Matteo said, stepping out from behind Clara. Look at yourself. You're hiding in a storage unit in the middle of the night. You're not a king. You're a thief. Arthur's face contorted with rage. I'm the man who provides. And if I can't have the sterling legacy, then no one can. He raised the gun, aiming it at Clara. But before he could pull the trigger, the sound of sirens erupted from the street outside. Blue and red lights danced against the corrugated metal walls of the storage units. Clara smiled. I told you, Arthur. I check in with my lawyer every hour. When I missed the 1 a.m. call, the GPS on my phone sent a signal. It's over. Arthur looked at the entrance, then back at them. For a moment, he looked like he might shoot anyway. But the sound of tires screeching and doors slamming shut broke his spirit. He dropped the gun into the dust and sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands. The months that followed were a blur of flashbulbs, courtrooms, and headlines. The Sterling scandal was the only thing anyone talked about. The stolen son, the papers called it. Arthur and Evelyn Sterling sat behind the defendant's table. Evelyn looked like a ghost, staring blankly at the wall, her mind long gone. Arthur looked defiant until the moment the prosecution played the recordings Clara had secretly made over the years, conversations where Arthur joked about the cost of a life and Evelyn's whispered confessions of guilt. The most silent moment in the courtroom came when Matteo, now legally Matteo Santos, took the stand. Do you hate them? The prosecutor asked. Matteo looked at Arthur, then at Evelyn. He remembered the bedtime stories, the expensive gifts, and the piano lessons. But he also remembered the coldness, the pressure to be perfect, and the woman who had died in the dark so they could live in the light. I don't hate them, Matteo said clearly. I pity them. They had everything in the world, but they didn't have a single real thing. Not even their son. The jury didn't take long. Arthur was sentenced to life for conspiracy, kidnapping, and indirect manslaughter. Evelyn was committed to a high-security psychiatric facility, where she spent her days playing an imaginary piano on a wooden table. A year later, the Sterling mansion was sold at an auction. It was bought by a developer who planned to turn it into a community music school. The Golden Cage was finally opening its doors to everyone. Clara and Matteo moved to a small house by the coast, far away from the whispers of Crestview Heights. They used a portion of the settlement money from the Sterling estate, money that was rightfully Maria's, to start a foundation for mothers in need. One afternoon, Matteo sat on his new porch, looking at the ocean. He held a small, silver locket Clara had given him. Inside was the only photo they had of Maria Santos. She had the same eyes as him. The same crooked smile. Clara came out with 2 glasses of lemonade. She sat beside him, the silence between them no longer filled with secrets, but with peace. Are you okay, Matteo? She asked. Matteo looked at the locket, then at the woman who had risked everything to bring him home to himself. He realized that a family wasn't defined by a mansion, a legacy, or even blood alone. It was defined by the person who stands by you when the lights go out. I am, he said, taking a sip of his drink. For the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am. The happy family was gone. In its place was something much better, a real one.